Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and we are hitting up their trope talk on It Was All a Dream. Now, this is a trope that I am not a particular fan of and that I have not really used in my writing, so I am not sure how much I will have to say in this video. One thing I can say, this is one of those tropes, in my opinion, that if you are going to use it, you have to be deliberately using it. You can't just like retroactively go, oh, it was all a dream. No, you have to be laying the groundwork for this is a dream from the very beginning, um, for it to work in my eyes. Otherwise, it's just gonna come across as kind of like cheap and lazy, and just a undeserved twist if you don't. Um, so before we dive in, though, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love to join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch, and please do go check out the gaming channel here on YouTube. So yeah. All that said, all that out of the way, let's just go ahead and dive straight in.
This video was sponsored by World Anvil, and yes, I assure you, this is all very real. Consuming media always involves a degree of suspension of disbelief. Not much most of the time, but the fact is, when we're consuming a story, we know it's not real. Getting invested is usually a matter of quietly convincing our brain that it's okay that it's not real. We're gonna put the realism on pause for a little and just let ourselves get immersed in the fiction for a bit. Sometimes we might need to crank up the
Honestly, I've never struggled with the whole suspending disbelief, so long as things are internally consistent. And even then, like if something isn't internally consistent, if it's thematically consistent, usually I can pretty easily just wipe it away. But I'm not like, I'm reading Babel right now by Rebecca Kwong, and there's something about silver that has magical properties to it. But aside from that, it is essentially in our world. I'm not having a hard time suspending my disbelief with that. I'm not like going, silver, that's so like, I don't believe it or whatever. I'm just like, I read a line where I was like, all right, there's the magic. Boom. No problem. I don't know. I've never struggled with suspending my disbelief for stories. I've never had to go, oh, this is a story, finding myself this is a story. No, I've always been just like, this is a story. Okay. And, I really can't think of a time where a story took me out. I'm sure there are some examples, but for the most part, I don't think I have.
suspension of disbelief a little bit. Like if we notice a plot hole or something just doesn't quite click, we might need to up our suspension levels a little so it doesn't break our immersion. But the fact is, even when we're really invested in a story, on some level we still know it's not really happening. This partially explains why the all a dream trope is such a notorious minefield. For context, the trope it was all a dream is a specific kind of plot twist wherein some portion of the events shown in the story are revealed to have been a dream, a hallucination, a simulation, or in some other way unreal. This happens in small ways pretty frequently. Anytime a character is shown to be dreaming, it's usually initially ambiguous whether or not the events being shown are really happening, with this only being confirmed one way or the other when the character is shown to wake up. But these are individual scenes. The all a dream trope tends to be more of a thing when it's applied to larger parts of a story.
See, it works for WandaVision because one, it's fucking obvious. They say it outright pretty early on, but they give you, at least for the first episode, there's something about it where you are unsettled. WandaVision, I feel like, was a good show. It just, it wasn't my favorite. I certainly enjoyed Loki season 1 a lot more than I did WandaVision. It's just then Multiverse of Madness. I never watched it, but from what people have said, it just completely, did away with WandaVision. So, what's the point in fucking watching anything Marvel anymore? Like, doesn't feel as consistent anymore.
Like a whole episode of a show or the bulk of a movie. Now, fundamentally, the all a dream reveal is risky at its most base level because it disrupts the suspension of disbelief. It's a dangerous gamble to remind your invested audience that the things they're invested in aren't really happening. They know that already. Engaging with fiction involves kind of a shared pretense, like a social contract that the writer creates a fiction for the audience and the audience takes the fiction at face value. Not treating it like it's really happening in real life, but emotionally investing in it, imagining that the plot and characters could be real, empathizing with the things things that happen to them. If the writer then pulls back the curtain and says, "Surprise, you fool, it wasn't real after all," it's a disruption of that unspoken agreement. The audience is taught that they can't trust the story to be internally honest with them. If a story does this too much, writing off too much of its own plot as false, it can end up completely disrupting the audience's ability to take the story at face value, which can lead to some really bizarre consequences. Like, for instance, fans not actually believing the story when it does plot things they might not like. Sherlock, for instance, used a lot of twists about things not actually really happening, or things being hallucinations or false memories, or scenes happening in Sherlock's mind palace, or overall not actually happening like they were shown on screen. And I think this unintentionally cultivated a fan mentality where the audience straight up couldn't trust the show to be honest with them. This, I think, contributed a lot to the uniquely bizarre reaction to the season 4 finale, where it was a legitimate theory running around that there must be a secret good fourth Sherlock episode waiting in the wings that the showrunners would be releasing later, because the actual finale was bad. Like, really bad. Like, I was there. It was bad. But how could the audience trust that it was actually bad when they couldn't even trust what the show was physically showing them? Now, obviously, this is an extreme case, but it's a good place to start because it's a useful cautionary tale, I guess. Creators strive to get the audience invested in their story, but this is a really good example of how overusing this one specific trope can completely disintegrate that investment by just undercutting the audience's ability to suspend their disbelief. The audience already knows it's not real, but they have to trust the story to be honest with them, to construct a coherent fiction for them to become invested in. If the author disrupts that fiction by revealing it to be false, it's just bad. Tolkien had some thoughts on this too. When specifically discussing fairy tales, he put forward the opinion that no story that was all a dream could qualify as a fairy tale. If a waking writer tells you that his tale is only a thing imagined in his sleep,
A real dream may indeed sometimes be a fairy story of almost elvish ease and skill while it is being dreamed. But if a waking writer tells you that his tale is only a thing imagined in his sleep, he cheats deliberately the primal desire at the heart of fairy, the realization independent of the conceiving mind of imagined wonder. It is often reported of fairies, truly or lyingly, I do not know, that they are workers of illusion, that they are cheaters of men by fantasy. But that is quite another matter. That is their affair. Such trickeries happen at any rate inside tales in which the fairies are not themselves illusions. Behind the fantasy, real wills and powers exist, independent of the minds and purposes of men. He uses such big words that hurt my tiny brain. Oh, God. Yeah. Uh, like, I think essentially what he is saying is the author should not pull that veil. But like what he's saying is in the universe, in the story itself, a fairy will trick you, and that should be kind of part of the story. But the writer shouldn't, like, essentially he's the way I'm interpreting it at the very least is that the author is not pulling the rug out from under you. It's essentially character work. The fairy is a character, is a deceitful character within the story, and he is there to kind of, you know, no, I'm totally misinterpreting what's being said. Tolkien uses words that I do not understand.
he cheats deliberately the primal desire at the heart of fairy, the realization independent of the conceiving mind of imagined wonder. So basically, the all-a-dream trope is already a tricky beast to handle. While a lot of tropes can help or hurt the story itself, not many tropes actively damage the audience's basic ability to engage with the fiction.
So, like, one way this can work is the all-a-dream trope, if it is still within the fictional world, right? Like, let's say you have a character having dreams and they think they are real, and then they come out of the dream, but then they are still within the fictional world. Like what happened in the dream cannot be the whole story, I think, is one way of looking at it. You can see my naivety when it comes to this trope and how I just do not use it or really interact with it on the reading side of things, on the consumer side of things. And so I'm very, like, kind of just out of my element here.
It's worse, the all a dream trope tells the audience that they shouldn't have gotten invested because there was no point. Nothing that happened in the dream was real, and that tells them not to be invested going forward. But this conveniently leads us into a more helpful angle, because the all a dream reveal does not have to mean that the events of the dream didn't matter. Now don't get me wrong, it is way more common for writers to play it that way, and it's not even necessarily bad. If the events of the dream were really unpleasant or sad, with like major character deaths and stuff, the all a dream reveal becomes a relief. But broadly, the it was all a dream so it didn't matter twist is pretty unpopular, and with good reason. It undercuts its own story. But
well, it's because the way I look at it, and I don't know if this is how Red is going to say that she looks at it or how the popular opinion is, but the way I look at it is time invested, right? Time is important, right? We value our time and what we spend our time doing things, which is why bestseller books are the best sellers and why there isn't a more equilibrium in the book space in terms of selling things. Because if you know, a large amount of the population really enjoy one book, right? Or this one book is getting consistently good reviews, more people are going to check it out. And now, of course, there are books that get good reviews that still go fly under the radar, and that's just going to happen with the amount of books that get written. But bestsellers are bestsellers for a reason, because the general populace feels like their time is not going to get disrespected by the product. And kind of the all the dream trope kind of, for a lot of people, feels like it's just going to be a waste of time. Why it's such a tricky trope. You have to then, if you are doing this, you are also having to do double the work, essentially, because you have to lay down the groundworks of, this is a dream. You have to convince the audience that it matters, and their time is not going to be wasted with the reveal at the end, with the all the dream reveal, the inevitable reveal. So the way I look at things is kind of, especially with tropes, is and things like that, is essentially just value of time. Like, is this going to undercut someone's time spent, essentially? Like, time is valuable. You don't want to waste people's time.
But just because it was a dream doesn't mean it didn't matter, and there's a lot of ways for a dream to still matter even post-reveal.
I don't know if I explained that good in any semblance of the word.
For one thing, the events of the dream can have a lasting effect on the characters involved. Might have taught them a valuable life lesson, or given them a glimpse of a darker, more unpleasant scenario they want to avoid, or left them with lasting trauma that needs unpacking, or otherwise had a tangible impact on their character. It's also possible that the dream might be obscuring something very real and potentially quite high stakes, like for instance if the character realizes they're dreaming because they're in the process of actively dying and they need to wake up to fix it. The Justice League story for the Man Who Has Everything is a unique twist on this, where Superman is trapped in a dream where Krypton was never destroyed and he has a beautiful family and a quiet, peaceful life. But he needs to destroy that perfect fantasy and wake up, or the supervillain who put him in the dream is going to do very bad things to the world. Giving up that imagined life and family is an incredibly heroic sacrifice that really upsets him. Or, in cases like The Matrix, waking up from the dream is a very early step one in the plot, and the entire rest of the story is about navigating a very harsh reality. Some all-a-dream twists also leave it kind of ambiguous how unreal the dream actually was. A character might wake up and assume the events were a dream, but little hints might suggest that it was actually at least sort of real, like an item from the dream showing up in real life. This is one variant of the all-a-dream trope, but there's lots of ways to play with it, so we should probably talk about some of them. The most basic version is the plain vanilla all-a-dream reveal, where a character wakes up and realizes the stuff they were experiencing was just a dream. Nothing that happened was real, and they're back in their normal life. This is the simplest option, and as discussed, it's a heck of a gamble, and a lot of writers don't seem to notice this. The movie version of The Wizard of Oz, for instance, changed the plot from the book to make Dorothy's adventure in Oz all a dream, because the creators were worried their sophisticated 1930s audience didn't want to watch a movie that was a fantasy adventure in another world.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Now, it was obviously much more interesting to make a movie about a girl getting a concussion. The Disney version of Peter Pan does the same thing, implying that the kids were dreaming the whole adventure. In both of these cases, the books make it very overt that the fantastical adventure is really actually happening. In Peter Pan, the parents are freaking out about their missing children when they get back, and while The Wonderful Wizard of Oz ends with Dorothy having no way to prove that she went to Oz, it's definitely a real place. Like in one of the sequels, Dorothy and her family end up moving to Oz full time, so they don't end up homeless after the farm is repossessed. For some reason, some writers seem to think that it's safe safer for them to couch their fantasy works as just dreams rather than having to commit to the bit. It just ends up undercutting the adventure and making the whole thing seem.
I guess this is where I have a disconnect with this trope because, as I say a lot of the time on these trope talks, is commit to the bit. Commit to what you are writing. Commit to your themes. Commit to the story that you want to tell. Don't cut it short because otherwise then it's just going to not be as good. And so I don't understand this concept from other writers where they're like, oh, the audience isn't going to believe it or whatever. We've been telling fairy stories since the fucking beginning of time. We're going to believe a whole lot of shit.
Pointless. Taking an existing fantasy and reframing it to be all a dream just betrays a level of insecurity on the part of the adapters, an unwillingness to let their fiction be fantastical. As a contrasting example, Alice in Wonderland really is all a dream in the book too, and it makes sense. The plot is completely nonsensical and follows dream logic. The adventures are fun, but the all a dream reveal doesn't really break the audience's investment because it doesn't really feel like it was happening anyway. Some adaptations will actually change it so Wonderland isn't a dream and is instead a Narnia-style fantastical otherworld, and those versions need to do some heavy lifting to make the original setting even halfway coherent. This ties into the next major variant, maybe a dream. Some stories will leave this purposefully ambiguous. The character will wake up and probably assume what happened was a dream, but there will be clues or hints that it was real on some level. This also applies in situations where the character's not dreaming, but they might be experiencing some kind of fantasy or delusion. In some stories with magical realism, it's not clear if the magic is really happening or not, but there's enough evidence to support the it's real interpretation. This is more the realm of fan speculation than it is a narrative trope, but a lot of writers aim to make the fantastical elements deliberately ambiguous. For instance, Pan's Labyrinth interweaves one girl's fantasy otherworld with an otherwise brutally realistic plot, and it's a little unclear if the magic is real or if it's just a wishful delusion from a very unhappy child, except that if it isn't real, some plot holes open up, like how the main character was able to escape from her locked room if she didn't actually use magic chalk to draw a doorway. For the record, its director Del Toro says he thinks the magic is real, but it's left ambiguous so the audience can draw their own conclusions. This ties into
Really, you can just leave it as it's a Guillermo del Toro movie. And boom. That's enough explanation needed for the weirdness in a movie.
All a dream, but real in its own way, where it's not ambiguous that the character was dreaming, but that doesn't mean the things they saw and did weren't real in some way. This has overlap with maybe a dream, but also applies outside of it, like if the character dreams they're interacting with some surreal otherworld, but it's implied that this otherworld is more than just their own dream. Neil Gaiman's Sandman series is built on this trope, since the protagonist Morpheus is the personification of dream, and his realm of dreams is very real in its own way. This is also how the all a dream thing works in Over the Garden Wall. Spoiler alert, skip ahead if you're dodging those, but while the protagonists don't initially realize there's anything more to their situation than just being lost in the spooky woods, near the end of the show, Wirt remembers how they got there and realizes the last thing he remembers before the unknown is narrowly avoiding getting hit by a train and falling into a freezing lake. After he successfully defeats the big bad in the finale, he wakes up moments after falling into the lake and manages to get himself and his brother safely out of the water before they drown. So the unknown was basically a very complicated near-death experience, and there's lots of hints throughout the show that the unknown isn't quite real, like how their adventure seems to take several days but the moon never changes its phase. But even after the heroes wake up back in the real world, we're shown how some of the storylines in the unknown resolve and how the characters they met along the way get their happy endings, implying that it's more than just a dying dream or a hallucination. The unknown is, in some sense, its own reality, and it's actually implied to be the afterlife. There's the fact that you can draw a direct line between the plot of Over the Garden Wall and Dante's Inferno, starting with both sets of heroes finding themselves in a dark and spooky forest with no further explanation, and continuing through 9 more episodes that perfectly line up with the 9 circles of hell, and how their guide is called Beatrice, and how at one point they need 2 coins so they can ride a fairy, and if you're really looking for it, one of the characters the boys meet in the unknown is buried in their town's graveyard. It's wild. The unknown is clearly some kind of underworld adjacent situation, but it's still left kind of ambiguous how real it is. Now, the twisty version of this trope is the old just kidding, it wasn't a dream. This cuts through the ambiguity of the previous versions and confirms that the questionably real parts of the story were totally real and totally happened. This is usually used as a very deliberate fake out. Sometimes the characters will wake up and assume they just had a very vivid dream, only to realize that, nope, it was real, have fun with that. This is often used if the just a dream reveal would have actually been a relief, like if something very unpleasant just happened. In that case, this is a bit of a knife twist, presenting the possibility of a just kidding and then undercutting it with harsh reality. But sometimes things get sneakier. A character might be tricked or manipulated into believing what happened was just a dream, only to gradually realize the truth and snap back to reality. It's fairly common for a hero in a fantastical adventure to wake up in a painfully boring and mundane world, convinced that the whole fantasy adventure was just wishful thinking or an overactive imagination, making it look like the story is setting up for the mother of all disappointing only a dream reveals, reveals, only to learn that this reality is actually the false one, often being maintained by some dream-weaving villain or other hallucination-inducing antagonistic force keeping them in the dream and out of commission. Bonus points if their fantastical friends and or love interest manage to break them out of it. And a fairly nasty variant of this trope is the dying dream, where not only is the adventure revealed to have been just a dream, but the character having that dream was also dying the whole time. We touched on this with Over the Garden Wall, but it's not uncommon for the character to realize they're dying before they wake up, and waking up might become the win condition they need to actually survive. Of course, this is probably the nicest way to do this subtrope. It's a lot more common for this reveal to be a double whammy of disappointment. Not only was the adventure not real, but the character we got invested in was dying the whole time and is usually dead by the end of the story. You thought it was something cool, but it was actually a tragedy and you didn't even know it. Great. This is also a twisty fake-out trope, but it's kind of the exact opposite of the just kidding variant. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is basically the archetypical example of this trope, and it kind of works because that's all that story is. It's a very short story that starts with the POV character being executed and ends with him being dead, and everything between is a surreal escapist scenario where he miraculously escapes and runs home. We don't really have any outside context for the POV character, so while it's twisty and a solid example of writing, it's not as actively frustrating as it would be if we'd already gotten invested in this character. This trope is less popular in writing than it is in fan theories, because frankly, it is the easiest fan theory in the world. You can take any story and claim that it's just a fantasy some character is making up, because every story is a fantasy some writer is making up, and if you want to make sure the fan theory has no loose ends, just add that the POV character is also dying. It makes it edgy and sad, and completely undercuts all the joy in the original story by framing it as a tragic delusion, a last gasp from a dying brain. Anything positive or cool or compelling in the story just becomes sadder from this perspective. Oh man, they must have really wanted to be happy to imagine something like that. How depressing. I think this is why this variant is comparatively a lot less popular than the rest. All a Dream can be melancholy sometimes, but it's rarely crushingly depressing, and the happy parts of the story still have value just by virtue of making the character happy, even if they weren't real. The Dying Dream variant typically undercuts that. Not always, though. There's ways to do it that are emotionally impactful without being pointless. The character managing to survive is one way to do this, but some stories will also give the dying character some kind of catharsis or closure through the dream sequence to make the concept more bittersweet than just plain depressing. I think this trope is very deceptive. I don't just mean that it's like a twist that messes with the audience, I think it's deceptive for writers. It looks so easy. It lets you write whatever you want, break the status quo however you want, and then retroactively delegitimize your own story breaking by saying it was all a dream. The audience still saw it, the characters still experienced it, but now you're not responsible for making it real in your story. But it almost never has the intended impact. Most people don't write all a dream stories because they're aiming to thoroughly disappoint their audience, and most don't even consider that it might break the audience's trust in the fictional narrative as a whole. It looks clean and pretty and simple. Drop in this one trope and you can do anything in the story. Bring back the dead, introduce characters from totally different times and settings, do full episode Alice in Wonderland homages, write in all kinds of fantastical surreal scenarios without having to do the world-building heavy lifting to actually make them internally coherent. But if you're not careful, it erodes the foundations of the story. And almost no other trope has that effect. There are plenty of unpopular tropes that can disappoint an audience, but almost none of them attack the audience's basic ability to suspend their disbelief. Not even breaking the fourth wall can break an audience's trust in the narrative. But the basic fundamental premise of All a Dream is that the story cannot be trusted. Plenty of narratives break the audience's trust in little ways. Mysteries will omit key details to preserve tension, plot twists startle the audience by being unexpected, but this trope doesn't just tweak the audience's perspective on the story, it calls the whole fictional reality into question if the writer isn't careful. There's a reason why most of the well-liked versions of this trope are either ambiguous about how unreal the dream was, or purposefully subverting the expectations of the trope by confirming it actually was real. Audiences do not like being jarringly pulled out of the story to be reminded that fiction isn't real. So, yeah, and thanks again to World
like to
Anvil
play pretend. And that was Trope Talk All the Dream, and kind of as I predicted, I didn't really have that much to say here because kind of not really experienced with this trope. But this was a good video by Red as usual. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.